Welcome to Spiritual Healing Coach. Sister, this is your safe space, a place where we talk honestly about church hurt, spiritual abuse, and toxic teachings, and where we find healing together in Jesus, who never silences your voice and never calls you too much. Today we're looking at something that can feel scary to name. What if the pastor I trust is actually a narcissist? If you've had that uneasy feeling but haven't had the words for it, you are not alone. We're going to count down 5 clear signs your pastor may be a narcissist so you can recognize the patterns and start to breathe again. Sign number 5. They can't share decision-making. Sister, have you ever noticed how everything at church seems to circle back to the pastor? The meetings can't start until he arrives. The ministry idea isn't valid until he gives approval. Even small details somehow need his final say. At first, you might think, he's just a strong leader, but over time, it feels less like leadership and more like control. Chuck DeGroat, in When Narcissism Comes to Church, says it plainly. A narcissistic pastor cannot step away. In his mind, he is essential in every decision. That's not leadership. That's ownership. And here's why it matters to your heart. When one person hoards all the power, everyone else gets smaller. Your gifts are overlooked. Your voice is minimized. You start to doubt yourself. You leave meetings thinking, maybe I shouldn't have spoken up. Maybe it really is just me. That constant shrinking? That's not the Spirit of God. That's the weight of narcissistic control. But the Bible tells us something different. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul says, "The body does not consist of one member, but of many. Every person in the church has gifts. Your gifts matter. Your insight matters." Jesus designed his church to be a shared body, not a one-man show. So if you've been feeling invisible under this kind of leadership, hear me clearly. You're not imagining it. You're not being rebellious. You're discerning something real. And God never intended his house to feel this small. That's sign number 5. Next, we'll talk about sign number 4. When a pastor doesn't really listen, and why their lack of empathy leaves you feeling invisible. Sign number 4, they don't really listen. Sister, have you ever worked up the courage to share your heart with a pastor, maybe about a concern in the church, a question about scripture, or even a hurt you've been carrying, only to feel brushed off? Maybe he cut you off mid-sentence. Maybe he gave you a quick answer that felt more like a lecture than real listening. Or maybe his eyes drifted past you like he had somewhere more important to be. That's not just rudeness. That's a pattern of narcissism. Chuck DeGroat explains it like this. In the end, his impatience reveals an absence of empathy. In his self-referential reality, others are a mere commodity. A narcissistic pastor doesn't really see you. He sees what you can do for him, or how you reflect back on his ministry. If your story slows him down, if your pain feels inconvenient, he tunes it out. And here's what that does to you. It makes you feel invisible. You walk away wondering if your voice even matters to God. You replay the moment in your head thinking, maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I talked too much. But sister, that's not what happened. You weren't heard because he never intended to listen. Contrast that with Jesus. Every time a woman came to him, he slowed down. He listened. He let the bleeding woman tell him her whole story, Mark 5:33. He sat at the well with the Samaritan woman and engaged her questions with dignity, John 4. He honored Mary for choosing to sit at his feet and listen, Luke 10. Jesus never rushed women aside. He made space for them. That's the difference. Healthy leaders reflect Jesus by making room for your voice. Narcissistic leaders silence you by dismissing it. So if you've ever left a pastor's office feeling smaller than when you walked in, hear this. Your need to be listened to is not selfish. It is holy. You deserve empathy, and God's ears are never closed to you. That's sign number 4. Next, we'll look at sign number 3. When a pastor refuses to empower others, keeping all authority tightly in his own hands. Sign number 3. They refuse to empower others. Sister, have you ever volunteered at church, eager to serve, only to feel like your role was constantly shifting, or like you were trusted with the work but never with the authority? Maybe you poured yourself into a ministry, but the pastor kept moving the goalposts. Maybe your ideas were praised in private, but quietly sidelined in practice. This isn't just disorganization, it's a sign of narcissism. Chuck DeGroat describes how narcissistic pastors delegate without giving proper authority or with too many limits. In other words, they hand you a responsibility, but then keep such a tight grip that you can't truly lead. This isn't about equipping the body of Christ. It's about protecting their control. Here's what that feels like for women. Exhausting. You're doing the work, but never receiving trust. You're invited to serve, but not to shine. And little by little, you start to wonder if maybe you're the problem. Maybe you're not gifted enough. Maybe you're too opinionated. But the truth is this: it's not about your lack of gifting. It's about their lack of humility. Now compare that with Jesus. When he sent out the disciples in Luke 10, he gave them authority. He trusted them to heal the sick, to proclaim the kingdom, to represent him. He didn't hover or micromanage. He empowered. He believed in them. That's what real spiritual leadership looks like. A narcissistic pastor, on the other hand, can't let go. He may flatter you one day and then pull back the next. He may rearrange titles and structures so no one is secure. It's a way of keeping everyone dependent on him, and it leaves women especially feeling drained, overlooked, and replaceable. So if you've been running in circles, trying to prove yourself under this kind of leadership, take a deep breath. Sister, you are not the problem. Your gifts are real. Your calling is valid. The one who called you doesn't dangle opportunities like bait on a string. He delights in seeing you thrive. That's sign number 3. Next, we'll talk about sign number 2. How narcissistic pastors use intimidation and fear to keep people quiet. Sign number 2. They use intimidation and fear. Sister, have you ever noticed how some pastors don't even need to raise their voice to make you feel small? Maybe it's the sharp look across the room. Maybe it's the way they twist your words, making you second-guess yourself. Or maybe it's the stories you've heard. People who spoke up and suddenly found themselves pushed out, labeled as troublemakers, or quietly frozen out of community. That's intimidation. And intimidation is one of the clearest marks of a narcissistic pastor. Chuck DeGroat writes that some narcissistic pastors are bullying intimidators who use their power to wield control. Their followers may defend them fiercely, but often it's out of fear, not love. Step out of line, and you'll feel the chill. Cross them, and suddenly you're on the outside looking in. Here's what that does to your spirit. It makes you doubt your courage. You feel the urge to speak, but your throat closes up. You think, if I say something, will they turn the church against me? Will I lose my friends? Will I even lose my place with God? This fear isn't holy conviction. It's spiritual abuse. But look at Jesus. He never ruled by fear. He said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. When people tried to trap him, he didn't lash out with intimidation. He answered with truth, and when women came to him, like the woman caught in adultery, he refused to condemn. He lifted her up instead of tearing her down. That's the difference. Healthy leaders create safety. Narcissistic leaders create fear. So if you've ever walked into church with your stomach in knots, afraid of saying the wrong thing, hear me. That fear is not from God. God's love drives out fear. 1 John 4:18. You were never meant to live under intimidation disguised as leadership. That's sign number 2. Next, we'll look at the most subtle but devastating tactic of all. Sign number 1, faux vulnerability, when a pastor pretends to be humble but uses it as another way to manipulate. Sign number 1, faux vulnerability. Sister, this one can be the trickiest to spot. because on the surface it looks like humility. Maybe your pastor shares a personal struggle from the pulpit. Maybe he tears up in a meeting and says how hard leadership has been. Maybe he confesses something that makes you feel sorry for him. But then, when the moment passes, nothing changes. He's not actually open to accountability. He's not seeking healing. That vulnerability was used as a tool to keep you loyal, to draw your sympathy, or to make you feel guilty for questioning him. Chuck DeGroat calls this vulnerability. It's a false kind of openness. Instead of creating trust, it manipulates it. Instead of drawing you into real relationship, it pulls you into the orbit of his ego. And here's the wound this leaves. You feel confused. You think, but he seems so honest. Maybe I misjudged him. Maybe I'm being too harsh. That confusion is the point. Faux vulnerability blurs the lines, leaving you stuck between compassion and suspicion. But Jesus shows us what true vulnerability looks like. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he poured out his fear and anguish to the Father in honesty, Luke 22:42. On the cross, he exposed his pain fully. My God, why have you forsaken me? Matthew 27:46. And yet, his vulnerability was never a weapon. It was love poured out for us. A narcissistic pastor imitates the shape of vulnerability, but strips it of love. It's a mask, not a heart. And it leaves you carrying the burden of his image while your own needs go unmet. So if you've ever felt like your pastor's openness somehow made you feel guilty, silenced, or manipulated, trust your spirit. That wasn't true humility. That was a performance, and you do not have to carry the weight of someone else's mask. Sister, we've now walked through 5 signs of a narcissistic pastor. They can't share decision-making. They don't really listen. They refuse to empower others. They use intimidation and fear. And they show faux vulnerability. If these signs resonate with your experience, know this: you are not alone and you are not crazy. God never designed his church to crush your voice. He delights in your gifts. He honors your heart, and he will never use fear to keep you close. If this spoke to you, take a moment to breathe and remember, you are loved, you are seen, and your story matters. If you'd like to support this channel and help keep these videos free for women like you can visit kofi.com, Spiritual Healing Coach. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what's next.